Hey everybody, I'm Mike Maier, and today I'm going to try and help you guys out understand your coil springs on your old school Mustangs. Fox body guys, this will help you out a little bit too. Either way, a little bit of information for trimming coils. Lots of people over the years have asked me this, and I probably needed to make this video about 15 years ago. So on with it, real fast. There's a couple of basic things you need to know about cutting coils. First off, let's identify what coil do I have. I got a Mustang, I'm buying a coil, or I got a 620, or I got a 720, or hell, I don't even know what I got. Identifying your coils, pretty easy. There's a couple basic ways. You want to measure the coil diameter. Okay, you hear people talk about 620 or 720 coils. It's not the spring rate. 620 and 720 is not pounds. It's the wire diameter. 620 is roughly 5/8 of an inch. 720 is roughly 3/4 of an inch. Spring manufacturers wind springs in regular wire sizes. 7/16, ½ inch, 5/8, 3/4 wire. That's a rough starting point for an engineer to develop a spring rate. Next thing is how many coils per foot, and then the diameter of the actual coil itself, of the spring. You can go online and look up online spring calculators. They'll ask you to measure the wire diameter. They'll ask you to measure the spring diameter. And then they'll ask you to measure how many active coils you have. 1, 2, 3, 4, roughly 4.5. They don't mean when they say active, the top and the bottom coil. Those are more or less steady. They're not springing, if you will. Another couple of interesting things is you can have a 620 coil in multiple different spring rates. You can have a 720 coil in multiple different spring rates. As we see here, we have two 620s. This has a lot more coils than this spring here. This spring has less coils. This one is going to be a stiffer spring rate than this spring. So the less coils per foot generally means that spring is going to be stiffer than the spring with more coils per foot. So here's two different 620s with two different spring rates. Here's a 720. You can see this has a pile of coils, and this is going to be a fairly soft 720. Now, the other thing to know is 620s normally hover around a 500-pound spring rate, 550-ish. 720s normally hang in the 600 range. For what we're doing today, the increments that you trim the coils that we're going to be talking about in a minute, it doesn't really change for that small of a change in spring rate. Now, the other thing is 620s were generally, I want to say, kind of an OE big block spring from the mid-60s, I think. But they were a lot taller for the big blocks, so those guys were using those originally for small blocks to get the cars to handle a little better, bump up spring rate a bit. Anywho, without getting all in the history and whatnot, we're going to also talk about how far to cut your spring. If we're going to cut a spring, I can't tell you how many guys have cut their springs too far, and they use the standard term, hey, I cut a coil off. Oh my God, dude, you totally freaking dumped your car. Well, you got to be careful. Some of those guys that cut a coil, they got lucky if they didn't hose it. Here's a typical spring. What I'd like to do is I like to sell a customer a full height spring for their car. 67 and up, it's going to be about 13 inches. 65, you're going to see around 12 3/4 to 12.5 inch for a 620 or a 720. Now, if we want to lower a 65 Mustang or a 67 Mustang or whatever with either of these springs, let's say we put the spring in and the front of the car is hanging out around 9 inches off the ground. I measure the cars from the pinch weld. It's under the rocker panel at the seam where the factory tells you to jack it up by that seam just underneath the car. I measure from there and not the fender. Over the years, I've learned that guys have hit things, have flared their cars, have done Uncle Buck did some Bondo job in 1975 to the quarter. So that quarter's all over the place, or the fender's all over the place. We can't really get a true measurement off the fenders anymore. So I measure from the rockers underneath the door sills. and that gives me a real accurate point. So back to it. In the front, let's just say we put these coils in the front of the car is hanging out around 9. The back of the car is hanging out around 8 inches off the ground. I want to cut the car, I want to lower the front of the car an inch. Okay, so to bring the front from 9 to 8 inches. What I'll do is I won't generally put the shock back in when I'm going through this exercise. I'll leave the shock out, I'll take the spring, I'll put it in, I'll put the car down on the ground, and I'll measure it. Once I measure it, then I go, okay, it's at 9, I want to drop it down. I'm not going to cut an inch off of this coil. The way I do it is I take the spring out. It normally sits in there like so. The open end is at the bottom. I pull it out, I put it on my workbench. If this spring is here at 13 inches, I want to drop the car an inch. I'm going to bring this down to 12 and a half. This mark here is 12 and a half inches of free height. A ½ inch of free height will drop that car an inch. The reason why this is because the spring is mounted halfway between the body and the wheel. So whatever happens at the wheel, or at the spring, happens twice at the wheel. It's a 2-to-1 motion ratio. If you want to drop the car, let's just say an additional 1/4 inch, because you want to get that nose down effect a little bit, and we cut this thing down to 12 and a half already, if we want to lower it another 1/4 inch, we're going to take the spring down to 12 and 5/8. Or excuse me, 12 and 3/8. That's only an 1/8 of an inch off. It's only an 1/8 of an inch off. That was all we did right there to drop the car another 1/4 of an inch. It's not much, but remember, whatever happens here happens double at your wheel. I'd rather have you do little nibbles at a time and creep up on your ride height than take a big whack and come back and go, dude, I need to buy another pair of springs. That's happened a bunch. Okay, so the other thing to know about cutting your springs is trying to dial in your ride height. A lot of times these leaf springs don't settle evenly in the back. So when they don't settle evenly, maybe the left rear is a little low, the right front's a little higher than the left front, and the right rear is the same height as the right front. So the left rear is lower than the right rear, right front's higher than the left front. Everything works on diagonals in these in cars in general. So if the left rear is low, right front's high, we can trim that right front coil, let's just say an 1/8 of an inch off, whatever the measurement is that you want to drop. So let's say the front's high, a ½ inch on the right front, then higher than you want it to be. You can trim a 1/4 inch off of the free height here. Say go from 12 and 3/8 to 12 and 1/8. That'll drop the car a ½ inch on the right front, and what it'll do is it'll raise the left rear, and it'll make the left rear closer to even with the right rear, and on the right front will go down and trim out and be even with the left front. So a lot of times when you're taking measurements on your car, pay attention to the diagonals, okay? And the other thing is, whatever you trim the coil here will happen double at your wheel. So be cool when you're cutting. Don't get all excited and hog off a whole coil. You'll smoke those springs. The other thing is, cut the spring with a cutoff wheel. Try not to cut it with a torch. When you reheat the metal, it'll soften the metal up and you'll lose some of that spring rate. Sure, you'll hear about your cousin's buddy who did it with a torch and it turned out cool, but this is your money and this is your spring. Let him do what he's going to do with his car. Cut it with a cutoff wheel. Use your safety glasses, ear protection gloves. These things are gnarly, but they do keep the heat centralized and down in that part of the spring. The other thing is, don't set your ride height before your car is done. The second to last thing you do to your car is setting your ride height. The last thing is you do your alignment. I can't tell you how many guys have called me up and said, man, my ride height's all funky. I thought it was going to be awesome. And then you say, well, tell me about your car. Turns out the motor's not even in the car, or the interior is not in the car, or maybe the gas tank and the window glass isn't in yet. But they got their buddy sitting in the car, so it should be pretty close to the same weight. Nah, not at all. You got to have the car completely set, ready to go, the wheels, the tires, everything you're going to do before you go and cut your coil. So make sure when you trim your coils also, after every time you trim it, you roll the car forwards and backwards, settle that front end, let the wheels relax. The front will come down a little bit. Driving it for 100 miles, no, not so much. These springs won't settle like that. You just need to roll it around a little bit in your garage. I hope some of these tips will help you out. Yeah, good luck with trimming your springs. And check out Mike Maier at MikeMaierInc.com, Facebook, Instagram, Mike Maier Inc., all those good things. We'll catch up with you guys later. Thanks a bunch.